Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Trust Your Gut podcast. I'm Dr. Alaina Puff, and I'm going to be your host today. I want to begin by thanking you so much for tuning in today and following along on this journey. I am so thrilled to be here with you all. Today, I'm going to pick up where we left off last week, but before I do, I just want to begin by saying thank you to everyone who has reached out to me following last week's episode. It was a raw one for sure. Sharing the story, the continuation of the story rather, of how I failed my psychology licensure exam and how devastating that was to me. I had so many people reach out to me sharing their personal story, whether it was in the psychology field or in the mental health field and beyond, of how you didn't pass your licensure exam and what your personal experience was. And it honestly gave me such peace knowing that, first of all, I was not alone in my experiences, but also opened really beautiful conversations around what are these licensing exams and these certifications and these arbitrary, seemingly, hoops that we are expected to jump through as professionals. What do they mean? What do they represent? And how does someone who is inherently intuitive navigate these barriers to be able to really serve our clients and do and work our medicine in a way that feels really supportive to us? So anyone who connected with me, I just want to personally thank you because I always enjoy getting feedback and just hearing about your stories as well. I think that's something that I'm most looking forward to in future episodes, is bringing on some wonderful guests that I'm coordinating behind the scenes as we speak to not only just share my story, but share the story of others. That is really the intention behind this podcast and using this platform, is to give you perspective, varied perspectives, in fact, of people who are walking along their journey in hopes that it will inspire you or provide guidance as you either begin or continue along finding your most enlightened and ascended point. So, thank you again. I just wanted to start there. So, today, doing something different is where I left you last week. I was at rock bottom with failing my licensure exam. And I really want to spend part of today's episode unpacking that and really exploring why that was such a hit to my ego, to my sense of self-worth, and how flow state was birthed out of this very dark and trying time in my existence. And so, uh, you know, to pick up where we left off, I was very much at a loss after I failed my exam. As mentioned in the previous episode, I wasn't quite sure what came next. At that point, I was still serving clients as a postdoc at a private practice in Scottsdale, and I was still very much enjoying that work, but I knew this perception of my own intuition coming online and how I could potentially serve my clients through this lens was something that was definitely looming in the background, and I really wasn't sure how to proceed. Immediately after failing the exam, my initial instinct was, let me retake it as quickly as possible. At this point, I had spent hours upon hours and also thousands of dollars. I left that out. Thousands of dollars in study prep material to, really try to absorb as much information as I possibly could. So the instinct was like, let me try again as soon as possible. Well, here's another barrier in the system in the state of Arizona, and it's similar. There's variability, but generally there's a wait period in between taking these exams. So here in the state of Arizona, I had to go through the whole getting approved process through the board of psychologists to even get approved to sit for it again. And what they don't broadly advertise is that you have to pay another fee, which is $800. So just for perspective, this was something that I kind of knee-jerk reaction kind of threw myself into because I thought that was what I should do. But as I mentioned last week, my coach really slowed me down after that experience and said that I have two choices. And so I began to really play in possibility of what that other choice could be. What could be my professional identity as someone who doesn't take this exam again and really leans in to the knowledge and wisdom that has been coming online for me and transmit that through my work. Well, there's not a lot of models out there that I was able to build off of. So I really had to use my imagination and my creativity to determine what this is, and also think about what this meant for my own personal identity. Cue the identity crisis, folks. Here we go. You ready? So, I don't believe that experiences in our lives, whether it's positive or negative, I don't believe in coincidences anymore. And so failing this licensure exam was not coincidental. It absolutely needed to happen this way in order to get me to where I am sitting here today. Hindsight's 2020. However, the identity crisis that ensued was really around some deeply rooted personal belief systems that I was clinging to and needed to be disentangled for me to really ascend to my next level and ultimately create flow state. So, I want to talk about a little bit what came up for me because I don't think these are particularly unique internalized beliefs to me. I think a lot of our audience can really plug into a lot of these. So, I wanted to take some time today to talk about them. So, first and foremost, one of the most resounding messages that came through after I didn't pass that licensure exam was the shame and embarrassment around not passing. You talk to anybody of my colleagues who go through this process, most people don't even tell folks in their lives, including their like partners, when they're taking this exam because they're so terrified of having to tell them or break the news that they didn't pass. There's this like taboo, like we do it in secrecy kind of thing. I felt that very much so. I had been talking openly on social media leading up to the exam because I wanted to share my story of studying and learning how to integrate my self-care and this life that I was creating in conjunction with my studying to show that I can blend these worlds together in hopes that others could identify with that. So I had been openly vocal throughout this whole process, which I don't believe is the norm. And to be on the other side of it, to say, oh, guys, I just did all that and now I didn't pass, was incredibly vulnerable. And I felt so ashamed and embarrassed to openly talk about this. And I ended up going on Instagram and posting a message about it and sharing openly with my audience that I had not passed. And I remember it was one of the most daunting and scary things that I had ever put on the internet because it really opened me up to a host of criticism. I was afraid that I was going to lose clients. I was afraid of what my peers were going to think of me, that I was going to be perceived as less credible than I was before. And it really played at that imposter syndrome, which was something that I had had to work through throughout the duration of my educational career. And now I felt like here is the testimony of why I don't belong with the other psychologists out there. Here's why. And so it really pulled on those strings that were kind of tugging at me to like keep this silent, to stay in my shame. And what's so interesting is by putting my voice out there and showing that yes, someone who is successful and accomplished and very intelligent can fail this exam. People came out of the woodwork. People came out of the woodwork. My DMs blew up with some people that I didn't know and many people that I did and respected who were psychologists and were practicing, all sharing their testimony of how they had failed the exam, not once, but multiple times. And for me, I was in complete disbelief because I was like, why aren't we talking about this? Why isn't this open information? The perception that's out there is that everyone passes on the first time, and if you don't, there's something inherently wrong with you. So, a very interesting experience to hear from others and, give their positive words of encouragement. And, um, I took that and it helped normalize my experience, but yet everybody has their own way to make sense of this process. And for some people, their mentality was like, I need to get back on the horse and do this. And I just couldn't find the motivation to study again. Every time I would sit down to reorient myself to the materials, I just hit such a roadblock. And looking back on it, I do believe my intuition was coming through then by creating that resistance. I had been so diligently studying prior to the exam and to feel so hesitant to get back into that and just feeling like just a general sense of discouragement that wasn't lost on me by any means. So really having to work through that embarrassment and shame of like being open about this. I mean, even reflecting on last week's episode, that took a lot of courage to get on there and share with you all because I'm still continuously working through that. The other piece that it really tapped into was my sense of perfectionism. So we've all heard of perfectionism. It's an extension of anxiety. Um, Kids are susceptible to it, adults are susceptible to it. It doesn't really um, omit anyone. Perfectionism is more than just being produced in an environment of high expectations. The interesting thing about perfectionism is it's an internalized state. And so this directly plugs into our sense of self-worth. And so by failing this exam, my self-worth was jeopardized from my point of view, and my perfectionism was no longer, right? Up until that point, I had been pretty successful in everything that I had put my mind to, more or less. And this was really, there was no way around this. You couldn't get past the numerical score on the printout. And I remember I had the printout and I taped it up on my wall in my office and I wrote in Sharpie, "This test does not define me." Because I needed like a visual reminder because every time that somebody would ask or I would think about studying, I just kept going back to this like, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you should be ashamed that you didn't do this. And I needed to be constantly reminded like, this test is arbitrary and it doesn't define you. And so with my perfectionism came this idea. I think that was where the knee-jerk reaction to start studying again was, well, I just need to focus a little more on this section, or I need to just like practice my note cards, just deviating back to how I had always done things. And the reality was is that this content was so expansive in nature as far as the areas that it covered. There was no way you could physically or mentally memorize what was being asked of you on this exam. Like there was no way. If you came up with a way, please leave me a comment and let me know. So with that, my self-worth was directly challenged in coming up short on this exam. And really the most profound message that came through was around how I perceive myself as being worthy or good based on being productive, based on producing something, getting an A on assignment, having perfect attendance at my job, going above and beyond for a client. Over my many, many years of being in school and out in the workforce, I had begun to attach my own identity to everything external from me. And this can create a lot of chaos internally because we don't have control over many external things in our lives. So if we're placing all our value and worth on those external pieces, when they ultimately fluctuate, because they will, it creates this huge wave of distress internally because we don't know how to make sense of that. And so when I was going through this process, I was able to identify that like my worthiness was directly attached to this exam. It was attached to the arbitrary license that I thought I'd be hanging in my office. And so it began the process of me rewiring that in a way that allowed my self-worth to be more attached to internal parts of me. What make me Dr. Puff? What makes me Alaina? Like, what are these qualities internal to me that make me unique in an individual versus how productive I am or how much work I get done? And I talk a lot with my clients about this. Like, we're not alone. Like, many people think that by attaching their worth to other things outside of themselves is is the way to cope through these stressful or, disappointing situations. And it's really turning that energy inward. So I really was just processing a lot of this and trying to make sense of, why so much of this exam reflected these really hurt wounds that I had been carrying around for a long time. So again, like I said, nothing is coincidental. It all comes with a purpose. And that's my advice for you is When you are faced with disappointment or failure or anything that's just really challenging, and this can be in your personal or professional life, there's always an invitation there. Nothing happens to you just to make you miserable. There's always an invitation woven into the fabric of whatever that situation is. And it's our responsibility to investigate that and uncover what that might be. And so, in doing that and going through my own reflections, I realized that up until that point, I had attached my whole identity to becoming a psychologist, to my work. I was a full-blown workaholic. And this goes back to episode one, where I'm sitting at my graduation ceremony, having this realization, getting this intuitive ping that there's more to life than that. But I had been groomed up until this point in an environment that told me otherwise. So here we are, another crossroads, an opportunity to do something different. In retrospect, I totally could have went back and crushed that exam in the later months. I know that I had the capacity to pass that exam. The exam was not the issue, if you're really getting to the heart of it. The exam was just an arbitrary crossroads that I had to go through. But really, the intention behind this exam was for me to pause, to reflect. What is my divine purpose here? What are my motivations for getting out of bed every day? Am I doing it truly for myself, or am I doing it for the perception that I'm going to give off to society, to my clients, to my peers? As my coach said, I had two choices. I knew if I took the choice of retaking the exam and following that trajectory that I had always sought after, I knew what that was going to look like. The other one, not so much. And here we are again, the edge of the cliff, toes hanging over, looking down into the abyss. And you think you do that once and like that's enough for a lifetime, but apparently it comes up over and over again. And so at this point, I had jumped before. I had jumped more than once at this point, and I had landed. And it had been all in my own benefit. So I took a deep breath and I chose the other road, the road less traveled. And I knew there was something here for me. And I just started to walk that path. So what does that look like? So I'm not going to take the licensure exam again. I still have a pending application out there with the board. And I decided no, no more. We're done with that. We're done with the time, energy, money, all attached to it. And what I decided to do, I started researching different avenues that I could continue to see clients, and I found the coaching industry. And I'm going to be completely honest with y'all, like I had such a negative perception of the coaching industry prior to entering it, um, largely because my exposure to the coaching industry was the misuse of it. And as someone who had gone through 10 plus years of schooling, I want qualified people helping others. And, one of the things with the coaching industry is it's highly unregulated, so there's no way to safeguard that at this time. And so as I was exploring potentially entering that industry, a lot of things were coming up for me around, well, am I not qualified because I'm not licensed? And who's going to believe me? And I'm nothing but a failure. And all those internalized belief systems that I just spoke about were ringing so loud in my head. And I really was forced to sit in that, to sit in those questions, to sit in those hurtful accusations that I was making of myself. And thus to be reminded, you know what you're doing. You know what your gifts are. And it allowed me to create spaciousness in myself so that I could begin to lean into those gifts and create this new identity of who Dr. Alaina Puff is. And so I decided to lean into the coaching industry because it was a safe haven for me to be able to continue to do my work. But what I did not realize in making that decision was there was a personal and professional shedding that I had to go through to create my business. Up until that point, I had always wanted to be the psychologist. I wanted the fancy office and I wanted to wear blazers to work and I wanted to just be this buttoned up professional. And choosing something different was really, really challenging. It was really hard because I had to let that go. And with that came a bunch of grief. A lot of grief because the vision that I had for myself was now shifting again. And at this point, I've gone through so many shifts in the span of 1 year, less than a year at this point. It was really, really challenging. I felt like I was grasping at nothing, like sand running through my fingers. And I didn't know if anybody was going to take me seriously. I really questioned my knowledge and my sense of worth. And saying that out loud right now is really, really challenging because, in retrospect, I can say, like, I know my worth now and I understand my professional value. But at the time, I had realized again that I had attached my self-worth to the externalized perception of being a psychologist. That little piece of paper up on my wall of my office was going to be, the stamp in time to show everyone in society that I was worthy, that I was worthy. And that's just not true. It's just not true. So I was going to enter into the coaching industry and I knew I wanted to run with this intuitive piece, but I didn't have all the pieces. I didn't know I knew nothing about starting a business or anything like that. And in the backdrop during this entire time of the exam and processing in the months after, I had really been pushing the edges of my work in private practice with my clients. I was working with all these highly sensitive children who come to find out were very intuitive. I actually created this free quiz, which I include in every show notes. So there's a version for adults and there's a version for kids. I used my knowledge about intuition to create a free quiz where people could go ahead and answer some questions that assess the general markers of intuition. And I had all my kids take it, and they all came back highly intuitive. And at least one, if not both, of their parents did the same. So, like, again, I don't believe in coincidences. Here I have these beautiful kids with these beautiful intuitive gifts like right at my disposal, like right there, willing to try anything because for many of them they had been in therapy for literal years, traditional talk therapy, even play therapy, and the families were reporting no progress. So I began to push the boundaries of that. I began to speak directly to their intuition, to their intuitive gifts. And I was kind of just taking data as I was going to figure out, like, is this working? That I'm deviating off script a little bit? Um, and the answer was yes, it was working. They were getting better. And I wish I had the magic recipe for like I could wave a wand and all their difficulties could go away. But I think one of the most powerful tools that I provided them and what I equipped their parents with was this perception of just validating that their intuition is real, that their feelings that are associated with their intuitive gifts are real, that they're not crazy. The times that I have shared with you up until this point where I felt legitimately crazy, all I needed was validation to remind me that I'm on the right path. And while that originally had to come externally from me, I've now learned how to get that internal validation that I know through the wisdom of my body that this is my life's purpose. I wouldn't rather be doing anything else than this. And so I had this data and I was seeing my clients just generally get better. Their symptoms reduced in intensity. Their anxiety went down. Depression went down. My friends with ADHD became more regulated. I was speaking directly to their intuition, but also speaking directly to their nervous systems, creating calm and peace in their homes, helping their parents co-regulate with their children. And I knew I was on to something. And so what really came to be was I knew that I wanted to create something of my own. I wanted to create a safe harbor for these kids because these kids also, they were me growing up. Like I was very much could identify with their lived experiences. They knew they were different, but they did their best to try to fit in. Just how I had tried to fit in up until that point of being a psychologist, of being a doctor, of being highly educated and knowledgeable. But it was time to step out, y'all. And so everything shifted for me, not only professionally, but personally. I mean, down to like what I was comfortable wearing. My wardrobe had a shift. Like I remember like being at this networking event and talking to this group of women entrepreneurs, and I was like, I just feel like so much changing. And like, I had a blazer on. I was like, I don't want to wear this freaking blazer anymore. And all the women were like, take it off, like, get rid of it. And I like ripped off the blazer, like threw it across the room. And as silly as that might sound, it was actually quite symbolic for me because it was a shedding. Like you didn't have to be this buttoned up girl anymore. You didn't have to be this buttoned up professional. You could be the kind of individual who shows up for a session in jeans and a t-shirt and still be is able to be taken seriously. Down to my clothing. I had latched onto this identity that wasn't even me. It's who I thought I should be. And so the shedding continued. I didn't know where to begin in starting a business. I had no roadmap, as many of us don't. Up until that point, I had been working alongside a lot of entrepreneurs, going to networking events. So I had some tangential experience, but I didn't even know how to start an LLC. I didn't even know if an LLC was something that I needed. I literally didn't know. And so I share with you this experience because there is no roadmap. Like you literally get on Google and there's still no clear answer. And so, again, going back to what I shared last week, I knew I couldn't do this alone. And so, I knew I had to hire an accountant because numbers weren't my jam. I knew that I needed support getting an LLC started. And so, in order to do the LLC, you have to have a name. And I laugh because like duh, it obviously have to have a name, but I didn't want it to be like Dr. Puff and Associates. Like I didn't want something like that. That's what a former version of myself would have named it. Um, and so I was cleaning around my house or something. It was a weekend. I was just like moving things around. And as I moved something, a note card and a stack of papers fell onto the ground. And I went and picked it up. And it was one of my licensure exam study note cards. I had taken like hundreds of notes on these note cards, like flashcards to study. And the word that was on the note card was flow. And now flow is a psychological term, okay, to be in flow. It mostly comes out of positive psychology. And it's this idea that when you're doing something that brings you immense enjoyment, you lose track of time. You become so engrossed in whatever activity you're doing, like time collapses on itself, and it's easy, it's joyful, it's miraculous, it just happens. And it's this like psychological state of arousal. Um, and it was one of the questions that I had been studying for my exam, and I picked it up and I looked at it and I like literally heard from my body, this is going to be the name of your business. And I'm standing in the middle of my living room on a Saturday, just staring at this green note card going, what? Flow state, flow state coaching and consulting. I was like, yeah, sounds good. So immediately run over to Google to see if it's available on like the LLC lookup list or whatever directory. And it is. And I'm like, Flow State, Arizona. Like, yes, let's do this. And that was the beginning of Flow. That was the beginning. Filed the paperwork next week and we were off to the races. I think that my intention for Flow State was not only to work with kids and families, but also adults. And I wanted to work with them in a way to nurture their intuitive knowing, their gifts, their abilities. And in my personal opinion, I just don't feel like the mental health industry right now has space for this particular niche. I mean, I have many friends who are psychologists, counselors, social workers, and like as discussed in previous episodes, those folks are living in survival. I mean, I worked in community mental health. I wasn't paid very much. I had an enormous caseload of really intense clients. I had very minimal support from a supervisory standpoint. I was pouring from an empty cup and expecting to help people get out of these really dire circumstances and get better. And so I really had to think about how flow state was going to be different, how it was going to be different because it needed to be different. At this point, I had worked across so many different settings. I knew the setting wasn't going to make or break me. It was the whole system in which I was existing, the intersection of my personal and professional identity. It needed to match and merge for me to be able to really tune into my gifts and make it something that actually can be impactful for my clients. So I was feeling into this, and I think, one of the biggest things that I see, particularly with female entrepreneurs, people who really struggle with this, and I certainly did too, was this relationship with money and wealth management of your business. So like obviously if you create a business, you get your website up and running, you get your LLC, you make your website look all pretty, you start your marketing. You have to have like prices attached to what you're doing. And I knew that I wanted to do like coaching services. Um, and so there was the monetary aspect of that. And before I get into too much depth about that, I think the other piece that came up when I had to set my services was I had to write a consent letter for my clients. And again, another shedding of my identity was writing in that consent letter that my services should not be considered a replacement for psychotherapy. I consulted with legal representation around this to make sure that, my I's were dotted and T's were crossed. I literally had to write that my services were not a replacement for therapeutic ones. That was a hard day. I had spent so many years getting training in how to be an amazing and wonderful and talented therapist to completely invalidate it in a sentence. Lots of ego death that day. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. The vision that I was holding for myself and what I believed flow state could be was greater than any title, any board could give me. I knew my services were meaningful. And so that day, I let it go. I put it out there. I said, this might not be considered therapy, but I'm going to tell you this is going to be so impactful because it's coming from my gift, not the degree hanging on the wall or the letters that follow my name, but by who I am, who Alaina is, the way she cares for people and holds space for people. That's what you're going to remember. And that's what's going to make a difference. So with that, you gotta put prices on that, right? And so in conversations with other female entrepreneurs, this is tough because especially those of us who are coming out of this indentured servant mindset, if you're in education or the mental health industry or the medical industry, we are programmed from a young age that these industries require you to give all of yourself to your profession, to your clients. You just need to go down and meet them where they're at. And what nobody talks about, or at least in my experience, what nobody talked about was how freaking exhausting that is to do that over and over again, day after day. As a school psychologist, I would bend over backwards every single day to do something for my staff, for my students, for my parents, for my community. And when I didn't, I felt tremendously guilty for not. And nobody talks about what a detriment this does to your nervous system, to your body, to your mind, to your spirit. I think it's an unreasonable task to put anyone up to. So I knew that I had to build this business differently. I had to build it differently. I couldn't sell myself short. And pricing is the first extension of that. And, the insurance companies out here, like, I could do a whole episode on that, but the reimbursement rate for going with an insurance board is terrible. Ask any mental health provider. And so a lot of people are actually shifting away from taking insurance, which I know brings up a whole host of comments around accessibility, etc. But listen to this. What if I told you that meeting your clients where they're at, or this idea that I'm coming down to meet you where you're at, what if I told you that was wrong or inaccurate, rather? If we are, as a community, as a population, if this group of people are coming together in this shared goal to ascend to the highest point of yourself, where your body, mind, and spirit are all interconnected, if that's the goal, what if what if I could invite you up to where I'm at? What if I could extend an invitation with love, support, respect, to help you build the stairs in your own life to ascend to a higher place? I don't know about you, but like that blew my mind when that came up, when I made that realization. That blew my mind. What? And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, yeah. And going back, I have a lot of research and experience, particularly around like social justice and equity issues. And I think this is something that I never came across, this paradigm in my experience of like people who are oppressed by our society, communities that are particularly oppressed by our society. They're like, in my experience, sitting with mental health professionals at a table or in education was like this idea that like, oh, they're stuck, and then we attribute blame and then all these things, all that's why we have racism and xenophobia and all the things that we have. But what if you could help people see not only their worthiness, their true worthiness, but their potential, their ability to step out of poverty, their ability to step out of trauma, their ability to end generational patterns and cycles? What if you invited them? The ones who would step up and say yes, at least in my experience with clients, are the ones who are willing to try something different, just like I have shared with you in these past episodes. I, even when it didn't make sense, so desperately wanted to try something different to create a sense of happiness and success in my life that I took a risk. But that was only because someone invited me. Someone asked me, do you want more? And if it wasn't someone, it was, leaving my job was me saying, do you want more? That internal dialogue. And my answer was yes. So I wanted to build Flow State in a way that was accessible, but also in a way that really filtered out the people who were ready to work, who were ready to choose something different. And so that was just such a cool paradigm shift and so transformational in how I had operated before. And what I found is, as I started meeting with clients, I had fuel that I had never felt before in my work. I had energy that just took me to the next level and ultimately was able to provide this caliber of service that I would have never prior. And it was because the clients that I was calling in. It was the clients that I was calling in. It was completely reworking that system. So before, as I started to like slowly build my way up, I decided to have a launch party. So my launch party was November 11th, 11/11 of 2023. And this was really an important symbol in my journey because I wanted to publicly showcase what I had created. I talked in the previous episode about how the industry of mental health and psychology has historically been conducted behind closed doors. And I thought, you know what, it's time to shed some light on this, whether it was through my social media presence or conversations with colleagues, but a party, like that's next level, right? And so I wanted to put together this party to celebrate the launch, and I came together with this beautiful community that I had built here in Arizona of people who helped me plan it and coordinate it, and also different individuals in the community who were also serving children and their families. And so we came together on this Saturday, and it was a family inclusive event, and we just came together to celebrate intuitive children. And it will go down as one of my most favorite memories because it was ceremonious for a lot of different reasons. It was ceremonious because it was beautiful to see these families come together under the unified theme of healing. It was beautiful to see this community that I was the focal point of. Like I created the people that were there in conjunction to the event. Like I was steeped in that beauty of that community. Um, and I think most notably for me, it was this celebration of you did this. Like literally a year ago from that date, I was dysregulated sitting in an office after just discovering my body, going, oh my gosh, can't do this anymore. And in a year, I collapsed so many timelines because I did not let that fear, that anxiety hold me back from saying yes. Because I surrounded myself with people who offered me these beautiful invitations to grow. And I was so proud. I was really so proud of myself because there were so many opportunities to cop out, plenty of them. And I held this vision throughout of what I thought my business would be, what it could be, the potential that it held. And I knew I was onto something big. In fact, I went to a networking event shortly after the party, and it was a group of mostly mental health professionals. There were some other ones scattered in there, but it was this really professional event. And I stood up. We all had to stand up and like share who we were, what insurance we took, just to share with the group for networking reasons. And I got up and I said, my name's Dr. Alaina Puff, and I'm the psychologist that went rogue. I went rogue because that's what it felt like, but gosh, it felt so good to embody that. The psychologist who said, I know you laid these things down this road for me to follow, and I am choosing something different. I am choosing something that is more aligned with me and my purpose and my vision. And a lot of the times in the therapeutic community, we talk about like, oh, we all give advice that we never take. Like we give advice to our clients that we actually are so hypocritical for giving because we're out here, not following that. This creating flow state was a full embodiment of me owning and embodying every aspect of that. I was transcending to a place that I wanted my clients to get to represent this group of kids that had these strengths and gifts that are so often misinterpreted or misunderstood. By allowing myself to tap into my own intuition, to validate it, to appreciate it, I was able to create a business of my dreams, to then call in others to transmute that to my clients and call them in community to teach them to do the same thing. So I'm going to leave you there today. I feel like that is a good recap of kind of where I went from that licensure exam all the way up to the creation of my business and how I began putting the pieces together last fall to run a business, become an entrepreneur like overnight, and start to really set the intentions of why flow state was needed and what the purpose of my services were. So I appreciate everyone tuning in today. Thank you so much. Please leave any feedback or comments that you have. I would really appreciate it if you could give me a review. This is a great way to connect others who might be interested in this content. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. And I look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Take care, everyone.